Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's event with 192 Books and Paula Cooper Gallery. I am Evan, the manager here at 192, and I am so thrilled to welcome everyone to tonight's event with André Gregory and Joan Wickersham. We're going to be talking about André's new book, This Is Not My Memoir, a collaboration with Todd London that came out in 2020 from Farrar, Straus and Giroux. This book is the first to really tell André's life story, to dive into all his projects and his life, art, love, everything. And it's just a rare glimpse into this great artist's life. You don't already know, Joan Wickersham is a regular columnist for the Boston Globe, the author of the Suicide Index and News from Spain. And André Gregory is a writer, actor, teacher, painter, and maybe most importantly, a great reader. He's a store regular, and ever since I started here, it's kind of an occasion when André comes in, and just such a great book person, and we could not be more thrilled to have him here tonight. So Joan and André are going to talk about this book, André's life, and really any and everything they want. And then they're going to take questions from you, the audience. So if you have a question at any point during the night, you can send an email to evan@192books.com. That email is right below there, and I will relay it to them. So the earlier you ask a question, the better chance you'll hear it answered later in the night. So ask them early and often. So with all that being said, I'm really excited to get us started tonight. And we're going to hear from André with a reading from This Is Not My Memoir. So enjoy, everyone.
Are we here?
You're up.
So André, did you have a reading that you wanted to start with?
Oh, the whole book. No, I'm not really used to reading. Maybe the very first story, perhaps?
That would be great.
Yeah, okay, that's a good story to begin a book with. Oh, and my friend Stephen Kinzer. Do you know Stephen?
I don't know him. I know he's writing in the Globe.
Yeah, he writes for the Globe as well as writing terrific books on American foreign policy. And he wrote me an email just yesterday that I was coming across as a very warm, philosophical person. But he said I wasn't selling the book enough. And readings are about selling the book, he said. So, this is not my memoir. This is not my memoir. This is not my memoir. Buy it today. Now he'll be happy. Okay. The book begins with a quote from Sophocles, which I think is a very moving one. One must wait until the evening to see how splendid the day has been. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. When I was a freshman at Harvard in 1952, I had horrible roommates and got slightly depressed. As a consequence, I moved into an awful, rundown hotel in Boston to avoid them. When I went for walks at night, I would pass the Old Howard, Boston's oldest and most famous burlesque house. I don't know if it's still there. I kept returning night after night because of a stripper called Princess Totem Pole. I called her the Antonin Artaud of striptease after the mad French artist who envisioned the theater of cruelty. The princess had built herself a raked stage on which were great green abstract leaves she had painted. Upstage, there was a large totem pole with red lights that blinked on and off like eyes. She gyrated and bumped to the music of Ima Sumac. Two large blackbirds would strip Princess Totem Pole. They would peck at her clothes, and the clothes would fall to the ground. Eventually, I became the princess's assistant. One of my jobs was to feed the blackbirds. After telling this story for years, I decided that it was so unbelievable so outrageous that it could not possibly have happened. I must have made it up. So I stopped telling it. Given the amount of time, I generally rehearse the plays I direct, sometimes 4 years, sometimes as many 14. My next play, The Gambler, could be ready for an audience in time for my 100th birthday. As of this writing, I am 85 years old. Yesterday, as we were walking through a graveyard, my wife, Cindy, made me promise to live another 20 years. If I don't, she said, she'll kill me. And does it really matter if I complete the play? Isn't the joy of work in the doing? Isn't it the process itself that matters? Many years after I allegedly worked for Princess Totempole, I ran into a college classmate as I was leaving a restaurant. He greeted me warmly as if we were old friends. Then he said, "God, remember how I used to come visit you at the old Howard when you worked with that stripper? What was her name? Princess something or other, with those great big blackbirds?" So it was true all along.
It's a wonderful story.
Well, it's also funny because she offered me a job as her assistant. And instead of taking the job, I went back to Harvard. I think that was one of the biggest mistakes I ever made. I think it would have been much more interesting to go out with her.
You know, it's interesting to me that just now you said that you were going to start with the first story. So do you think of the book as a collection of stories rather than a sustained narrative?
That's a good question. Not really. The book has got sort of amazingly good reviews, and the critics tend to pick up the stories because I've had an amazing life. I mean, I can't believe I've had the life so far that I've had. But I think the stories are what Hitchcock called a MacGuffin. Have you ever heard it?
I have.
Yeah, it's the greatest example of a Hitchcock MacGuffin is Psycho, where you begin the movie thinking it's about an attractive young woman who's stolen some money, and then it turns out to be a complete horror story, and the star is killed in the first half hour, which never happens. So in other words, it's something to lead you down a false trail, that the work is really about something else. And for me, the stories are the icing on the cake. I think they lure you into deeper waters than it seems at first. But I love telling stories, as you know.
I do. I felt that too, though, when I was reading the book, that it is a really sustained story of a life, and really of the transformation of a life, the transformations of a life. And I thought it was very interesting. I imagine it must have been interesting for you to break out of the stories. You know, many of the stories in this book are stories you've lived with, and yet you're doing something. I felt that too, that you were doing something different, and that you were really talking about what is the shape of my life. There's a wonderful quote in the book. You quote, I think, Grotowski talking to an actor and saying, you can be born, it doesn't matter if you're born Van Gogh or Mr. X, but if you're born Van Gogh, you have to live fully the life of Van Gogh. And if you're born Mr. X, you have to live fully the life of Mr. X. Right. And I felt that the question that seemed to me to be driving the book was, so what does it mean to live fully the life of André Gregory? What is that?
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things is the willingness to take the bait. If I suddenly feel I'm being thrown some kind of bait, if there's some different direction I can go in, I go there. I've always had a hunger for doing what I've never done before, you know. And in a way, I think that helps reveal who you are. You know, who was that great English psychoanalyst who worked with underprivileged kids? Do you remember? Great psychiatrist. And he felt that the reason, I'm sorry, Stephen Kinzer, I know I should be selling the book. He felt that the reason for going into psychoanalysis is that from the moment we're born, we're influenced by parents, by schools, by the society we live in, to be someone other than who we are, that we come out of the womb authentically who we are, and that the purpose of analysis is to chip away at the false selves that you've assumed to become more who you are. So I guess without realizing it, because I had no purpose with the book, I was telling stories that have changed my life and would affect more who I really am.
Do you think that that search for who you are, and that what you just said about taking the bait, did you know that you were engaged on that kind of quest when you were young, do you think? Or do you think
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, I think maybe being in a lot of psychoanalysis and therapy, I might have become more aware of it, but no, I had no idea.
Because the bait that I see in the book often has to do with your vocation, and also often has to do with a teacher. And so those are two such important questions that I wonder if I could ask you to talk about each of them separately, because the vocation comes up over and over and over in the book. There's the story of the Petruchio. I'd love for you to talk about that. And then the ending of the Manhattan Project, you talk about how you had to throw away your career in order to pursue your vocation. I think that idea of a vocation, I'd love to hear what you...
Well, James Hillman, the Jungian analyst, believes very strongly that the vocation comes to pull us in. It looks for us rather than necessarily our looking for it. And what was I thinking? Oh yeah, I played John the Baptist in Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ. And what I love about that book is that Christ doesn't want to be Christ. That's his vocation, but he resists it. He wants to be a family man. He wants to have a home. And somebody pointed out that the crucifixion itself, apart from the Last Temptation of Christ, is an amazing symbol for neurosis, in that neurosis is pulling you in two directions at once with equal force. So I think one often, I don't know, is this true of you? Do you run away from your vocation at times, or do you always accept it?
I think I run away from the work sometimes.
Yeah.
But I don't ever run away from, no, I'm either doing the work, or I'm thinking about the work, or I'm feeling terrible for not doing the work.
And it must be difficult to work because you are, bar none, the world's greatest reader. So I'm sure reading always tempts you away from working. I've never met anybody who is as passionately devoted to reading as you are.
Well, we have to have this conversation as well. So I don't know whether to go off on this direction or just let's go there. But first, if you can just, actually, let's just go there. We'll come back to the vocation of the teachers. But Andre, I'm just going to tell on you a little bit. What I thought was wonderful was in the moments before this event started, when we were setting up with Evan from the bookstore, I thought it was wonderful that you used the time to say to him, so what are the new books that I should know about? What do you think I would like? I mean, it is, I'm always looking for the right book at the right time. And that's been really tricky, during this pandemic. I think it's particularly hard.
Reading during the pandemic has been amazingly, well, during the two epidemics of the pandemic and Trump, it's been, I've found, almost impossible to read.
Yeah.
But thankfully, thanks to you, and thanks to, I hope, the ultimate fall of Trump, I started reading one of the greatest books I've ever read, that I've read before, War and Peace. You started me on War and Peace, and it's amazing.
So tell me what you're finding in that book.
Well, I'm a little puzzled as to why I'm so riveted by the book, because I did read it when I was a lot younger, and I was sort of a little bored by the war sections, which I'm not at all now. I find the war sections as thrilling as the peace sections. War and Peace reminds me of that Hungarian book that you and I loved so much. What was that called?
It was the Transylvanian Trilogy by Banfi.
Oh, yeah. Heartily recommended to everyone. What that and War and Peace have in common, I think, is that they're both Gone with the Wind, but better.
Yes.
The storytelling is so astounding, but I can never really tell when I'm in the middle of a book why I love it so much. Can you?
Well, I think for me with War and Peace, I think some of it is the precision, just that every person's feelings are so complicated, and every aspect of that is just somehow he has time to tell you every single thing that someone is thinking in a moment, and it can go on for 3 pages, and yet you're still firmly held in that moment. So it's the precision. I also think it's the honesty. When I just think it's so refreshing to read something where people are so honest about their own discreditable feelings and contradictory emotions, because I think we're living in a time where there's such kind of acceptance of public dishonesty that it's just it's bracing to read something that's so so frank.
Well, I do one of the things I love in my book, this is not my memoir, is that relatively often I apologize for things that in retrospect I'm ashamed to have done. And my experience of some memoirs that I've read is that the writer seems to have an axe to grind, or they have some kind of desire for revenge. And I think what took me over was a desire for forgiveness.
Yeah, I was curious about that, André, as I was reading, because you talk a lot about what kind of young man you were. You refer to yourself as an angry young man, and yet you're very compassionate. I didn't feel that you were trying to justify yourself, but I felt that you were trying to be honest about what you were like, but also looking back, you have a kind of a compassion for that person, and also for the people around that person. And then I was also noticing the compassion you have. I was thinking, Cindy Klein, your wife, made this wonderful documentary, André Gregory, Before and After Dinner. And a lot of what you were talking about in that film was your parents, and how having a sort of nightmarish childhood in some ways made you an artist and comes into your directing. But in this memoir, you're really looking back at your parents and trying to put yourself in their shoes. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think, none of us, I talk about the possibility that my Jewish father was a Nazi collaborator. I don't know for sure, but it's quite likely. On the other hand, no one can know what it was like to be in his shoes in a Europe that was going fascist and Nazi. And as you know from our experience with Trump, we'll never know, did we behave well or not so well? Or did we take the actions, that we should have? So I think forgiving, not in a sentimental way, I think forgiving is a part of being honest with oneself, that it's a childlike thing to nurture grievances. I'm older than either both my parents were. My father died when he was 84, and I'm 86. My mother died when she was in her 70s. And they had a lot to deal with, and so I think that even though, in a way, my parents were Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and I always, there was a movie I loved as a kid where a young boy is traveling in a small plane over Africa, and the plane crashes, his parents are killed, and he's brought up by orangutans. and and I sort of saw myself as that. But then this, as the fine writer that you are, we never know whether our stories about other people are accurate or not. Are they true? What does that mean? The Suicide Index, your book before Spain, is dealing with your father's suicide. But I wonder how much still I could ask you, how much do you think you know now in retrospect about his life?
I think I know what I think I know much more deeply what I don't know. I think I was trying in the book,
great.
To kind of figure it all out. And I think writing the book helped me realize, of course, I can't. But it's also interesting, what you said, Andre, before about how sometimes when you read a memoir, sometimes you feel like the person has an axe to grind. I sometimes read books where I just want to back away and just say, okay, you settle that, but I'm getting out of here. But there's really a difference between writing about a grievance and acting a grievance out on the page. And that's
so well put.
It becomes uncomfortable. It's when you feel that you're actually, you're kind of in the room where the fight is happening, as opposed to listening to someone describe the fight. That's and I think that's what I think is important in your book. I love that I don't feel that you've figured all of it out, because you're figuring it out as you write, and we get to go along with you. But I also think there's a way that I feel that you're writing about heat, but you're not sitting at the table burning as you write. And I think that's just a really lovely experience for a reader. To feel that I felt that I was in good hands. It's a long.
That's good. That's good.
And that's what I think I look for when I'm reading in general. I was thinking.
Well, I know I was in good hands, because whenever I got really stuck on the book, I'd come to you because you're a great teacher, and you would help me.
Well, it gave us an excuse for a lot of good conversations.
It did. It did.
But I have one more question that I'm actually dying to ask you about reading, because when we talked about this conversation, we said we're going to talk about the book and we're going to talk about reading. But one of my reading questions for you is, do you sit around and read plays for pleasure?
Oh, I hate reading plays. I hate it. And in fact, many of the plays that I've done, like Wally's plays, which I couldn't even understand until I got into rehearsing them, I would just assume the play was great. I would read a couple of pages. But the problem with reading a play is the play is really a screenplay for a production. It doesn't exist until there's a production. Plays are not literature. And with the exception of, say, Beckett, who's a great poet, I don't think you can understand the play before you see the production. So I never read plays. Can't stand it.
See, I always assumed that I can't really read plays because I can't supply what's not on the page. For you, that all of that stuff that's not on the page, when do you find that? In other words, when do you find that through your work with the actors, or how do you start to realize what this play could be?
Well, with the Master Builder, with Ibsen's Master Builder that Wally adapted, I think I started to understand it in the 12th year of rehearsal. Because when I started to work on the play, I thought it was about an affair I'd had in my first marriage that I was a bit ashamed of, both for my wife and for the person with whom I had the affair, and that I'd been a total bastard to my family, and I felt guilty, and that it was all about that. But then around the 12th year of rehearsal, I realized, no, the play is about the fact that at a certain age, we only have one great work left to do, and that's the work of leaving this world. And that the Master Builder's struggle is to accept that he can no longer write anything more, that his task is to make peace with himself and learn to love himself a bit so that he can really leave the world properly. There was an actress in Vanya, wonderful actress in her 80s, and her last word was Geronimo. So we have to be able to leap out of the plane, pull the cord of the parachute, say Geronimo, and leap into the great unknown. So, but I didn't realize that's how I felt about life or about the play till the rehearsing of the play taught me to look at the world and at myself differently.
And do you feel that realizing that you're now finished with that particular play, or do you feel that if you were to go, I don't know if you have temptation to go back to that material? There's material that you've gone back to again and again over the course of the year.
I think the only one that I've gone back to over and over again is Beckett's Endgame. Because, as somebody says about bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, it's a play with no bottom. You can't get to the bottom of it. I think Ibsen is a genius with no talent. So it is possible to learn all you have to know, and going back would not teach you anything more. So I haven't had a desire with that play to go back. Yes. I wouldn't mind going back to Uncle Vanya a second time, because Chekhov, you can never get to the bottom of Chekhov. Yeah.
That would be, I hope you do go back.
I don't think I will.
Would you, well, never mind. That's a silly question, but.
It may not be. What is it?
Well, I guess I'm wondering, because I just, when you imagine possibly going back to it, or what does that pull feel like, and what would you do to go back?
For instance, I would go back to Endgame, Beckett's Endgame, because it's a play about lockdown. These people are stuck in a place. They don't know how they got there, or why they're there, or what it means, but they can't get out. So I think doing it as a play about lockdown would be a wonderful way to go back to the play.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. You know, it's interesting because when we were talking about War and Peace and what it is we are liking about it, I think one of the things that I'm liking about it is it's really about how one kind of megalomaniac leader with a bunch of, you know, people sucking up to him can throw the whole world into a complete mess. And I don't read for that, but I think that might be one reason why that is a book.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, well, I haven't got to Napoleon quite yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, but you can he's kind of coming through the air vents. I mean, you can smell him all the way through.
Yeah.
Andre, I have another question for you about reading, which is, you know, it kind of comes out of this question of returning to plays.
Then I have a question for you about reading.
Okay, my question for you is, are you a rereader? Do you go back to the same book? Are there certain books that you've gone back to again and again through the course of your life?
Yeah, there are a few. The Good Soldier by Ford Maddox Ford. Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann. So that there are some. Hope Against Hope.
Mm-hmm.
You must go back, don't you?
I do. I go back to Buddenbrooks also. That's one of my mine. And Great Expectations I read every few years.
Oh, I've read that a few times.
Yeah.
And I was tempted to go back to Middlemarch for the third time. But because of COVID and everything, my brain wasn't quite up to tackling it. But, you know, it's the same thing. Those books, you can never get to the bottom of them.
Yeah. Well, and they're different. They're really different each time you read them.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, what I was going to ask you about reading, because you read so much, is sometimes when I used to sit in the subway and I'd see someone opposite me reading a book, not looking at their phone or anything, and just completely involved with the book, I would wonder what's going on in there. What are they experiencing? Why do they read? What goes on in the brain? What do you think happens to us when we read?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think it feels like I'm being furnished. You know, like I've got an empty place and it's filled suddenly with furniture and people, and you know, I'm being filled with this other world and this other consciousness. And I think there's a way too that for me when I read, I often don't know what the hell I'm thinking or feeling. And
no, I don't.
And the reading kind of I recognize. For me, it's recognition. That's what excites me in a book is I recognize stuff, and often it's stuff I've never experienced, and yet I know that person is telling me the truth because it's so beautifully done, and I can tell when I recognize it, and I think that's what I'm looking for is that feeling of electricity and recognition because someone is giving me some aspect of what life is like, what it's like to be human. I feel like I get to be furnished, but then I also get to go inside their house and look at their furniture.
Right.
So I think there's something for me that it's recognition and furnishing somehow. What is it?
You know, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I had a great teacher at Harvard, William Alfred, the poet. And he taught a course in Anglo-Saxon poetry. And in the first class, he said, I'm sure some of you are here for the grade. Just get out of here. I will give everyone an A. I don't want you in here if you're here for the grade. And then the second thing he said was, I'm sure I told you this at some point. He said, you know, if you don't love a book after 50 pages, drop it. Books are like people. They could be great, but not for you. This is advice which I've always followed, and I think it's good advice for anyone who's listening or watching.
Yeah, I've seen that with you, that you just, you'll give it a chance, but then if it doesn't interest you, you don't have any feeling of duty.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
There are too many books.
Yeah. Do you find, though, I often find that there's a book where I kind of knock at the door and the book doesn't answer me, but then I knock at the door again 5 years later and suddenly I can
I think that's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that Cindy has some friends who, when I met them, I totally didn't get them. Unlike you, I fell instantly in love with you, but some of them I just don't get. And then 5 years later or 3, I do, and I adore them. So that thing people say about falling in love, that the time has to be ripe. I know if I'd met Cindy even 6 months earlier, she says the same thing. We might not have been drawn to each other. And I think it's the same with a book.
Yeah. So do you have any other recommendations for pandemic time reading?
Oh, boy.
I mean, we've kind of talked about how, in a way, War and Peace has been the one thing that's hit the spot for both of us during this time. But you read a lot. You read a lot of history and nonfiction as well. I don't know if you're able to do that while this is going on.
I've tried, but I haven't done very well with it. I know I found that when I'm unwell or under the weather, the best thing for me to watch on television is something like Ken Burns' long saga of the Civil War. I need facts. Fiction is too vague for me. But in this awful time, I've tried reading nonfiction and I haven't really done very well with it.
Yeah.
So I don't think I have much advice about that, except follow your heart. Go with what you love. Go with what you can't put down. I have no idea why I can't put War and Peace down. Seems irrational, but I can't. Do you have any thoughts for COVID? Reading?
No, I mean, I've had a lot of trouble settling down. I did read, I think I told you, I wanted to recommend this to you if I haven't already. I read Jay Perini's new memoir called Borges and Me. I thought was really wonderful. I guess I did.
Got it on the table. I've got it right next to me. I haven't got into it yet.
Yeah, it's really good. It's very surprising and very funny, actually, but really moving. And I don't know how he did it. I kind of it was like watching a magician do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm going to read it.
Yeah, you're going to really like it, I think.
And speaking of books, 192 books. I'm not just saying that because I'm here, but it is one of my favorite bookshops in the world. And part of it, I think, is that it's sort of like the old Curiosity Shop, or what I imagine the old Curiosity Shop. There's something very old world about it for me. And also the people who take care of the bookshop are all people who read a lot. So you can ask them, is there anything that you think I would like? And if they've known you for long enough, they come up with some very good suggestions.
That's wonderful. I miss that more than anything in the pandemic, is just being able to go into a bookstore and just.
Oh, knowing you, I can't imagine how you do without that.
So now, because we're getting to the end of our conversation, I'm going to pull you back to the book that I wanted to ask you again this question about teachers, because that's the other thread I saw going through the book, is that when you said earlier in this conversation that you're always willing to take the bait, one of the baits that I kept seeing in the book was somebody would show up and you would think maybe that is the next teacher, or maybe that is the
Mhm.
teacher. And so I wanted to ask you generally about the thread of teachers in your life. And then I wanted to ask you if you might read another section of the book that has to do with.
Absolutely. Well, you know, one of my spiritual teachers, Guru Mai, had talked once about what a blessing it is if in your life you find your teacher. She, of course, was talking about spiritual teachers, but it's a great blessing. And I myself, I like to teach, but most of all, I love to learn. So if there's somebody new who can teach me something, I'm always hungry for learning. And one of the things that saddens me now that I'm 86 is all of the people that I would have gone to as teachers are all gone. There were some there even until recently, but they've gone. That's sad.
Andre, you know, one of the things that I found really moving in the book, you wrote about a moment between you and your father where, because you write about how your father didn't really get it about being an artist, and he kept always thinking you would have been a great lawyer. But there's that moment where he's talking about one of his older relatives, I think an uncle perhaps, who was, and he says of him with great respect, he was a wonderful man,
His grandfather.
Yeah. And you said, well, what did he do? And your father said, well, he didn't do anything. He was a learner. And then you said, I'm a learner. And it was a bond between you and your father.
Yeah, because it was very funny. I think I talk about it in the book, but we used to fight a lot because he hated the fact that I did what I did. And soon after my dinner with Andre came out, he and I had a big fight. I can't remember about what. And my then wife, Chiquita, went up to make sure he was okay. And he said to her, "What's Andre's problem? Why does he get so upset with me all the time?" And she said, "Well, I think he thinks you don't respect him." And he said, "Don't respect him? Of course I respect him. He could have been a great lawyer." On the other hand, my father was a teacher to me in the sense that he was a terrific businessman. And of course, if you're a theater director, there's an enormous amount of business that you have to do around directing. And I think he sort of inadvertently turned me into an excellent producer.
Mm. So would you read one more section? I'd love to ask you to read about, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but when you go to Ladakh.
Ladakh. Yeah. Oh, sure. Do you know what page that's on?
Let's see.
I hardly know this book. Well, I could tell the story without even looking.
Tell the story. Yeah. What?
Okay. I'd been sent to India, to the Dalai Lama's sanctuary, to work with Tibetan refugees. And while I was there, the Tibetans wanted to do something nice for me because I wasn't doing it for money. And they said, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And I said, "Oh, I would love to go to Tibet." And they said, "No, you can't go to Tibet because the communist Chinese are there." But one day, one of the monks came up to me and said, "But we can take you to Ladakh." I didn't know where the hell Ladakh was. It turned out it was 3 days of journeying over roads that were 5,000-6,000 feet high without a railing on an old rickety bus. And now I think Ladakh had been closed for 40 years. because it was on the borders of China, Russia, Bhutan, and India. So it was, the Indian Army had closed it. Nobody had been there for 40 years. So I was literally the first Westerner to go up to Ladakh. And when I got up there, I was put on a farm. It was so high, you could hardly breathe. There was nothing up there. I stayed on this farm, and when I would brush my teeth in the brook every morning, the whole village would come down because they'd never seen a Caucasian, and luckily, 2 Buddhist women passed through with a Jeep. They were the next 2 people to go to Ladakh. And so I was saved from life on the farm, and I could go and journey with these 2 women. And we went to a monastery that had very high, thin windows, and there was sand on the floor, and gifts from hundreds of years had been packed into the walls, and facing each other were 12 monks and 12 monks who were playing long trumpets. And I felt as if the air had literally been kicked out of me. There was something so amazing about being in that room. I learned later that the monks had been chanting without a break for 400 years. If one fell asleep, another would come in and take his place. If one monk died, another would come in and take his place. So this room was like a resonator for spiritual chanting that had gone on forever. And the first stop I went with these women was a place called Hemis Monastery that looked like an abandoned ghost town in the Old West. And there were Tibetan prayer flags flapping tattered in the breeze. And a German abbot showed up and took us for darshan, for a meeting with the main monk. And when we walked into his place, the 2 Buddhist women went down on their knees and started to prostrate. I didn't know what I should do. I wasn't a Buddhist. Would it be impolite if I didn't do it? Should I do it? Would he be hurt if I didn't do it? And I was so taken up with what to do in front of him that I didn't really look at him. But when I looked into his eyes, it was as if I were looking at the whole universe. And I began to sob uncontrollably. And he began to laugh. And the more he laughed, the more I sobbed. And then he started to weep, and I started to laugh. And he was talking in Tibetan. I couldn't figure out what was happening to me. And at a certain point, he came and he took me by the hand, and he took me over to the window. Remember, this was about 8,000 feet high. And he pointed out of the window. It was about 2 p.m. And I could see the sky go black, comets shooting across the sky. And I had no idea what was happening to me. All I knew was that I was madly in love with that monk and wanted to stay there forever. That's the story. And of course, you can't explain these things.
No, that's why I don't want to ask a follow-up question.
No. No. For me, it's a miracle that we're sitting here in front of a glass screen and talking to each other. That's a miracle. I have no idea how it happens. I know a tech nerd would, but I have no idea. I can see you. That's a miracle.
Yeah.
And I think the miracle of a spiritual opening is devoutly to be wished, and we have no idea why it happens. St. Paul I think it was, who was a businessman, wasn't he? On the
Yes.
road. Yeah, he was on the road to Damascus 200 years after Christ had died. He'd never heard of Christ. He wasn't a spiritual man. And suddenly Christ appeared on the road and changed his life forever and Western Christianity forever. How do you explain that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. The whole thing is that you can't, and that's what makes it a miracle.
Yeah. Yeah.
André,
Yeah, I think it's important to accept that miracles do happen if you're open to it.
well, thank you so much for talking to me about the book. I really loved it. I think it's a really elegant moving book. And I know you very well, but I feel like I got to know you better even from reading the book. So,
well, I thank you. I love to talk to you about anything.
Well, I'm going to ask you now. We've got some wonderful questions that Evan has sent me from people who are listening. So I'm going to ask you some of these questions. This is a question. Ellie asks, Andre, which memoirists or writers did you look to while writing this book, and which authors do you feel have inspired your art the most?
Well, because I don't really think of myself as a writer. I think of myself as an amateur and a dilettante. I was overwhelmed by the task of writing a book. I can't believe that I did it. And I didn't read any memoirs while I was working on it. And I don't think I read any books out of the ordinary that I ordinarily would have read. So I wasn't influenced by anything or anyone, but I've certainly been profoundly affected by many books in my life.
So the next question is from Julie, and it's, when writing this memoir, was it difficult for you to choose the parts of your life you felt you could be candid about, or were you limitless in how open you were? Did writing the memoir force you to confront things you hadn't before?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I didn't feel there was anything I couldn't talk about, but there were things that I might have said if I were another writer about my first wife, my first marriage, or my 2 kids, or my parents. But I didn't want to hurt anybody. So I didn't gild the lily, but I was careful to be as truthful as I could and as gentle as I could. Now, what was this last part of that question? There was a good...
Did writing the memoir force you to confront things you hadn't before?
Absolutely not. No, I don't know why, but it didn't. Well, I would say, yeah, no, that's not accurate. I think it did lead me to talking about aging and death in a way I perhaps hadn't thought of before. And the journey from youth to death.
So here's one for both of us from Charles. Of course, they're both great, but if you had to pick one, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky?
Oh, you go first.
Well, I would say Tolstoy, but that's just because I'm deeply into War and Peace right now. But I think he's more to my taste because I think there's a way that he pretends to be dispassionate on the page, and I think I'm just a little more drawn to that. Andre?
Yeah, I was absolutely obsessed with Dostoevsky when I was in college.
So was I. Yeah.
I can't read him now. I just it seems too murky, too self-indulgent. The translations are awful. Even though I know this is a very popular translation of Dostoevsky. But Wally has pointed out that Dostoevsky is a very funny writer, and that no translator has caught the humor of it. And I think he may have even said that The Possessed or The Idiot is a very funny book, but you certainly don't get that in the reading. So I'm with you. I'm Tolstoy.
Yeah, I would put in a plug for Turgenev as well. I don't think he's quite as in that same, he doesn't quite belong in that same question, but I love him if we're thinking about Russia.
Oh yeah, I do too. And you know, since I've directed a lot of Chekhov, in case there are some Chekhov lovers out there, a story that I love is that Chekhov was invited as a relatively young writer to Tolstoy's grand estate, which was a huge honor. And they had lunch together on the terrace, and Tolstoy went over every single short story Chekhov had written to tell him what exactly he loved about that story. And then the last thing he said was, "But I beg you, stop writing those horrible, boring plays." He was wrong.
Well, you know what Turgenev said about Tolstoy, about War and Peace, when they were initially great admirers of each other and even sort of friends, and then they became more and more disapproving of each other as it went on. And when the first installment of War and Peace was published, Turgenev said, "Bad, boring, and a failure."
Not true. Not true.
Okay. So here, let's see. Oh, here's a lovely question. This is from Heidi. "These two sentences totally captivated me when I received the announcement about this conversation. And I'm still wondering how Andre would answer." And this is a quote from the promotion from 192 Books. "What does it mean to create art in a world that often places little value on the process of creating it? And what does it mean to confront the process of aging when your greatest work of art may well be your own life?"
Wow, that's such a big question. I don't even know where to begin. What was the first part of the question?
The first part was, what does it mean to create art in a world that often places little value on the process of creating it?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very interesting because with the exception of my dinner with Andre, I've always done work that nobody really wanted to see, or I've done work for a tiny audience in some tiny, strange spot. But I'm not doing it for the audience. When I think of the audience, I know that during performance, I've sometimes seen one audience member who is illuminated by the experience. They are lit up. That's my audience. That's who I'm doing it for, So I haven't really been bothered by the strange climate in which artists can work. It's what I do. It's my calling. I love to do it. I love to do it. That's one of the big things. So that's not a worry. And what was the second part of the question?
The second part is, what does it mean to confront the process of aging when your greatest work of art may well be your own life?
Oh, that's very puzzling. That's very puzzling. Well, Jung said something interesting in a way about that. He said, when you're young, your task is to build a strong ego. As you get older, your task is to give up that ego because you want to give a beautiful gift to God. And if you've spent decades perfecting the gift, that's a good gift to give to God. So on the one hand, you could say, well, why have I been working so hard all these years? It's just going to end, But I think it's somehow a gift. And as with the Master Builder, I would sort of hope that the work during all those years had somehow prepared me for better meeting the end. If that answers the question, I hope it does.
Well, that seems like a very good place to finish up. So thank you again for having this conversation.
Oh, thank you. I can't bear letting you go. And I hate leaving 192 books because I know I won't see it for a while. So aloha.
Thank you.
Oh, I hate to leave this conversation as well. That was so wonderful, and such a delight to be enmeshed in that conversation. Such a great talk on Andre's book, This Is Not My Memoir, as well as Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, again, of everyone. It's reminds me of just being here, and what a pleasure. Thank you so much again to André Gregory and Joan Wickersham for joining us tonight. If you want to get the book, 192 Books, we're back open after our renovations. We're open for safe, socially distanced browsing every single day, 11 to 5 until 6 on Fridays and Saturdays, so come on by. If you want to reserve a copy of Andre's book, you can send us an email, info@192books.com. And if you can't make it down to Chelsea, you can order from our bookshop page. That's right, linked to it on this page below, and they'll ship it right to you. There's going to be a recording of this conversation posted right after it ends. So if you missed the beginning or you want to send it to a friend, it'll be right here. And you can check 192books.com for our upcoming events. I think we have something coming up on the 25th on Beethoven, so that should be a real treat. And let me think, that's about it. Thank you again to our guests and for everyone who joined us tonight. And I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're done. Thank you so much. That was so